Have you ever wondered what happens when a whole country is told they can't have any fun for over a decade? No theatres, no plays, no parties. Well, when the ban was finally lifted in England, the result was an explosion of creativity, wit, and some of the most scandalous and hilarious plays ever written. This was the Restoration Age, and let me tell you, comedy made a comeback. In 1660, after years of Puritan rule, King Charles II was restored to the throne. This wasn't just a political change, it was a massive cultural shift. Charles was a lover of the arts, parties, and all things extravagant. He had spent his exile in France soaking up the sophisticated and often racy culture of the French court, and he brought that flair back with him. One of the very first things he did was reopen the theatres, which had been shut down by the Puritans in 1642. But this was on just a return to the old ways of Shakespeare. Oh no, this was something new, something bolder. This was the birth of Restoration comedy. What made these new plays so different? For starters, they were sharp, satirical, and incredibly witty. The playwrights of this era were unafraid to poke fun at the very society they were a part of. They targeted the fashions, the follies, and the flirtations of the upper class. The language was sparkling with clever wordplay, double entendres, and brilliant banter. This was the kind of dialogue that could cut you down with a single, perfectly delivered line. And for the first time in English history, women were allowed to act on the public stage. This was a game changer. Before, boys played female roles. Now, real women brought these complex, intelligent, and often very forward characters to life. Actresses like Nell Gwyn became huge celebrities, famous for their talent, their beauty, and their scandalous off-stage lives. The presence of women on stage added a whole new layer of realism and excitement to the plays. The plots were often centered around love, or more accurately, the game of love. They were filled with intricate schemes, mistaken identities, secret affairs, and characters trying to outsmart each other to get what they want, be it a fortune, a spouse, or just a bit of fun. This was the comedy of manners, a genre that put the social behavior and customs of the elite under a microscope and found plenty to laugh at. Now, you can't talk about Restoration literature without talking about the giants of the age. Let's start with the undisputed master of poetry and drama, John Dryden. Dryden was so influential that the period is sometimes called the Age of Dryden. He was a poet, a literary critic, and a brilliant playwright. He was appointed England's very first poet laureate in 1668. Dryden wrote in many styles, but he truly excelled at heroic tragedy and satire. One of his most famous plays is All for Love, published in 1677. You might think the story of Antony and Cleopatra was already perfectly told by Shakespeare, right? Well, Dryden took that epic romance and reimagined it for his own time. While Shakespeare's play sprawls across years and continents, Dryden's version is tightly focused, following classical rules of unity of time, place, and action. The entire play takes place in Alexandria on the last day of the lovers' lives. The language is grand, noble, and filled with powerful speeches about honor, duty, and overwhelming passion. All for Love is a masterclass in controlled, elegant, and deeply moving tragedy. It explores the idea of a love so powerful it defies empires and reason. But Dryden wasn't just about high-minded tragedy. He had a wicked satirical streak. His poem Absalom and Achitophel is a political masterpiece. On the surface, it's a retelling of a biblical story, but everyone at the time knew exactly what it was about: contemporary politics. It was a brilliant, sharp-witted attack on the king's political opponents, disguised as an ancient tale. Dryden's ability to blend poetry with political commentary was unmatched. He also wrote comedies, like Marriage à la Mode, which cleverly contrasts two plots, one a serious romance, the other a classic Restoration comedy plot, full of flirtations and partner-swapping shenanigans. Dryden was a true virtuoso, a literary chameleon who could do it all and do it brilliantly. But if Dryden was the king of tragedy and satire, the crown for pure comedy, the sparkling, cynical, and impossibly clever comedy of manners, has to go to William Congreve. Congreve came a bit later in the period, but his work is often seen as the absolute peak of the genre. His plays are less about slapstick and more about a war of words. The dialogue is everything. Congreve's most famous play, and arguably the greatest Restoration comedy of all, is The Way of the World. First performed in 1700, it's a dazzling and, let's be honest, incredibly complicated play about two lovers, Mirabell and Millamant. They are smart, sophisticated, and deeply in love. But there's a huge obstacle. Millamant's tyrannical aunt, Lady Wishfort, controls her inheritance. If Millamant marries without her aunt's consent, she loses her fortune. So, what does Mirabell do? He concocts an elaborate scheme to trick Lady Wishfort into agreeing to the match. The plot involves fake uncles, secret marriages, blackmail, and a cast of some of the most memorable characters in theatre history. There's Fainall and Mrs. Marwood, a pair of bitter, scheming adults. There's Sir Wilful Witwoud, a clumsy country bumpkin trying to fit into high society. And at the centre of it all is the brilliant, independent, and utterly charming Millamant. The most famous scene in the play is the proviso scene. Here, Mirabell and Millamant don't just declare their love, they negotiate the terms of their marriage like a business contract. It's not cold or unfeeling. It's a witty and surprisingly modern conversation about personal freedom, respect, and privacy within a relationship. Millamant insists on her right to dwindle into a wife, not to be called nicknames, and to have her own private time. Mirabell agrees, but has his own conditions. It's a battle of wits that shows they are true equals. The Way of the World is the perfect example of Restoration comedy. It's cynical about society, but optimistic about the possibility of finding true, intelligent love within it. The play wasn't a huge success when it first came out. Audiences were starting to prefer more sentimental, Moralizing plays, but its reputation has grown over the centuries. Today, it's celebrated as a work of genius. Of course, Dryden and Congreve weren't the only stars. There was William Wycherley, whose play The Country Wife is famously bawdy and features a clever hero who pretends to be impotent so that husbands will trust him around their wives. It's hilarious and shocking even by today's standards. Then there's George Etheridge, who kicked off the comedy of manners with plays like The Man of Mode, featuring the charming and utterly amoral Rake. Dorimant, a character supposedly based on a real-life courtier. And let's not forget about the first professional female playwright in English, Afrabain. She was a trailblazer, a spy for the king, and a writer of racy, popular plays like The Rover. She proved that a woman could write just as wittily and daringly as any man, paving the way for female writers for centuries to come. So, the Restoration was more than just the return of a king. It was the return of laughter, of debate, and of a theatre that was glamorous, intelligent, and unapologetically alive. It was an age of satire and spectacle, of poets laureate and pioneering women. The plays of Dryden, Congreve, and their contemporaries captured the spirit of their time with a brilliance and wit that still dazzles us today. They showed that after a long, quiet period, the English stage had found its voice again, and it had a lot to say. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the world of Restoration comedy, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more explorations into literary history. See you next time.